Hello everybody and welcome to Movie Talk with LR. Shazam and Detective Pikachu are two movies released by Warner Brothers in 2019 that did surprisingly similar performances at the box office. In this video I will be talking about how I think that had Shazam and Detective Pikachu had each other's release dates, that they would have both done better at the box office. One big factor determining the box office success of a movie is the movie's competition. Not only the amount of competition, but the type of competition that a movie faces can be fatal for its box office performance. This is one area where Shazam shot itself in the foot. Shazam was placed right between the year's two biggest hits thus far, Captain Marvel and Avengers Endgame. Not only are these the two biggest hits of the year so far, but these two movies are also Marvel movies. Shazam, being a DC movie, was put in a bad place as it was placed right between a Marvel rampage. And while on the subject of Shazam's competition, Shazam was also following the massive success of the horror movie Us and the mediocre performance of the family film Dumbo. Shazam was released 3 weeks after the massive $153 million opening of Captain Marvel. When Shazam opened in theaters, it opened with a very solid $53 million opening. Shazam continued its run with some very solid post-opening weekend legs. In its fourth weekend, however, Shazam was completely toppled by Avengers Endgame, dropping a whopping 66% from its previous weekend. From then on, Shazam's box office performance continued to fall drastically and barely made any more impact at the box office. Next, let's look at Detective Pikachu. What competition did it face? Well, in a sense, it faced more, but then when you also consider it, it faced much less competition. What do I mean by this? Well, let's look into things. Detective Pikachu opened during Avengers Endgame's third weekend at the box office. Detective Pikachu had to settle for second place with around $54 million in its opening weekend. Now, at first glance, you may say Detective Pikachu was able to manage to make a little bit more money during opening weekend and while facing more competition than Shazam did. However, all things considered, while yes, Avengers Endgame was boosting ticket sales, there wasn't much as far as new movies in the box office. Shazam was surrounded by new movies opening right before and after, such as Us, Dumbo, Pet Sematary, the small mediocre debuts of Hellboy and Little, and The Curse of La Llorona. Not to mention that following those titles that I just mentioned was Avengers Endgame. Now, following Detective Pikachu's opening weekend came the massive success of John Wick Chapter 3, opening with around $56 million. Then Memorial Day weekend came around, and the massive success of Aladdin came in. Following the breakout success of Aladdin came the disappointing or completely terrible performances of movies such as Godzilla King of the Monsters, X-Men Dark Phoenix, The Secret Life of Pets 2, and Men in Black International. Despite the major competition failing to live up to expectations, Detective Pikachu never really had strong legs at the box office. Now it's time to dive into why I think Shazam would have done better at the box office had it had Detective Pikachu's May release date, and why I think Detective Pikachu would have done as good or slightly better than it had done had it had Shazam's April release date. Let's start with Shazam. So, Shazam was pitted right between Captain Marvel and Avengers Endgame. At the time of Shazam's release, Captain Marvel was still fresh on people's minds. But even though Captain Marvel had just been released 3 weeks earlier, Shazam still wound up outperforming its expectations at the opening weekend and was beginning to have very strong legs. I think it's a pretty clear fact that Shazam's legs were stopped dead by the release of Avengers Endgame. However, here's one big question. How well would Shazam have done had Avengers Endgame not been released? I personally think that Shazam would have went on to leg it out to around 170 to 180 million at the box office. So this is why I think Shazam would have done better with Detective Pikachu's opening release date. Shazam would have been opening during Avengers Endgame's third weekend, rather than Avengers Endgame opening during Shazam's fourth weekend. This would have posed direct competition for Avengers Endgame, which would have had the hype died down a little bit, giving Shazam an advantage, as people would start talking about Shazam, and there would be no big movies to completely wipe away its word of mouth. I think Shazam would have performed the same way that it did in April during May in its second and third weekends, against the competition of John Wick 3 and Aladdin. I think this because Detective Pikachu had a similar second weekend hold, and they both opened around the same amount. Why do I think that would be able to hold better than Detective Pikachu during the Memorial Day holiday against Aladdin is because Shazam had a very strong hold in the Easter holiday, and I think that the Memorial Day holiday would have given Shazam the same hold. As I mentioned earlier, post-Memorial Day releases started doing extremely bad at the box office, due mostly to being very badly received by critics. I think Shazam would have taken advantage of this fact, as it had a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, similar to John Wick 3, and that movie did very well in June with its legs, due to what I think is its very strong Rotten Tomatoes score. Also, a side note, I think that had Shazam been released in Detective Pikachu's spot, that it could have opened with a 65 million opening, topping Avengers Endgame's third weekend. Add that to some decent legs, and it would have had a shot at even 200 million. However, I still think that it would have been more likely to hit 180 million. So, why do I think Detective Pikachu would have done slightly better in April? The reason? Lack of similar competition. Detective Pikachu would have been surrounded by horror movies and superhero movies had it been released in April, like Shazam had been. Yes, Avengers Endgame still would have been trouble for Detective Pikachu in its fourth weekend. However, I don't think it would have caused Detective Pikachu to drop as much as it did Shazam. Furthermore, Shazam continued to drop hard after the release of Avengers Endgame. I think Detective Pikachu would have had stronger holds after Avengers Endgame's opening weekend. A good comparison for this would be Rampage, which had a very sharp drop when facing against Avengers Infinity War in its opening weekend. However, after the opening weekend of Avengers Infinity War, Rampage started to have very strong holds. I think Detective Pikachu would have played similarly to this scenario. As for their international performances, yes, I think Avengers Endgame probably would have damaged Detective Pikachu's international performance. However, I also think Detective Pikachu could have done just as well, and had Shazam been released in Detective Pikachu's spot, it definitely probably would have done much better internationally, as it was having very strong holds before the release of Avengers Endgame. I even think that Shazam could have made 300 million internationally had it been released after. However, who knows? Maybe I'm wrong about both of these. Maybe they were just perfect the way they were, and neither movie could have done any better. Tell me what you guys think. Would Shazam done better had it been in Detective Pikachu's spot? Would it have been vice versa? Comment and tell me what your thoughts are, and I will see you later.